Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Melbourne Athletic Development Podcast. Jack.
John, how are you?
Very well. Today, it's you and I back together discussing a topic.
Well, a topic that we literally discussed for 13 seconds before we started recording.
Well, we've discussed this topic a little bit, but it's an idea and a concept that I've been exploring quite a bit, and it's not actually very well formed. And we thought that we would look at potentially exploring this in a way where we navigate what's going on and try and work out whether we're getting closer to what is actually going on.
Or further away, maybe.
Well, that might happen. So for those listening, apologies if you listen to this and you think these guys are lost, because it might actually be the case that we are lost. And I think we're probably both pretty happy to get that feedback. But I think it's important that we kind of explore it and see where we land with it.
Yeah, and I think too that this conversation is really about more of a philosophical discussion about how we conceptualize humans as a system and how we apply interventions to see change, and specifically thinking about it from a performance standpoint.
All right, well, I think we preface the context of it, right?
Yep.
So the context is this. Over the last little period, I've been struggling a little bit with the problem that some of my athletes that I've been coaching for a while have not actually necessarily been running particularly well, or their performance is sort of stagnating or even sometimes going backwards. Mm-hmm. And the thing that I found the hardest is, even in communication with them, they're adults and they're intelligent, and a lot of the discussions have been around the fact that a lot of the training that we're doing is very similar to what we've done in the past. The prescription, the sets, the reps, the density, the volumes of training, some of it's gone up, some of it's gone down depending on the specific needs, but a lot of it looks very, very similar. Yet the performance is not necessarily continuing to improve, or it's kind of decayed actually back to a level that's below where they were. And that in itself has, it's challenged me a lot personally, because I'm like, well, why is this the case?
I think even particularly too, if you just think about it from that simple lens, here you have a task where the requirements are pretty basic. You're applying specificity to their training demands, but you're not seeing the outcomes that you expect, considering that you're aligning with basic training principles.
And for those of you who've listened to some of our podcasts, you would have heard me ask a few of these questions in some of our recent discussions with people like Tim Gabber, where I said, is there an upper limit to how much you can do? Because one of the things that has been really obvious to me is, if you make an assumption about what is enough training to be at a certain level of performance, is that capping the capability of that person because you've made a decision about what you think they're capable of? Very much in the same way that I think that when you set, say, goals, if you only set the goal to be something that's very much within your ability to achieve, you won't exceed that, for one, but two, you may actually be limiting your capability. And, that's the discussion that has been had between ideas like having open goals versus very closed, very directed, these SMART goals, things like, on this date, I want to do X. By doing that, are you actually limiting what you're capable of because you are defining it really clearly? And it's not to say that that's not a good thing, but you do want to keep yourself open to the possibility of what's possible. And I started to think about this a lot in regards to these athletes and think, okay, I've said that doing this volume of actual training, or at least I've personally made that decision that this volume, based off watching what they do and what their performance is like in those particular sessions, that's enough. But the performance hasn't necessarily grown with that. And I started to look at some of the training, some people who would have heard me mention it, some of the training that has come out with people online. And it's a dangerous thing to do, I know, to look at what other athletes do and other coaches do. But one thing that one thing that I have been thinking about is, okay, like if I'm going to do that, how do I do it without necessarily just thinking I want to take what they're doing? And the concept that I've been looking at a lot is, what is the underlying principle that explains why what they're doing works? And what I keep coming to is, if you keep searching for the underlying principle, you end up finding what it is that you can maybe apply in your scenario, rather than just verbatim stealing, say, someone's training program.
Yeah, and making that distinction between, is what you're trying to take from it the nuance of what they're doing in their training program with the reps,
Specific
the
reps,
intensities, rest periods, or has it got to do with a bigger training philosophy that you see this person or their coach applying?
And the thing that I came to with looking at some of these more advanced athletes is that their progression seems to be associated with their, team, whoever it is, always looking for improvement and always looking to consistently grow their capabilities. Even when, and this is the caveat, because everyone goes, well, that's an obvious statement. You obviously always want to train to improve, and you always, that you need to train systems to a greater level than what they were. Even when it means that the type of exercises, the density, the volume, or the intensity of what you're doing seems disproportionate to what the other people within that population are doing, right? And that is clearly specific to that individual. So, for instance, as an example, if you decide for whatever reason, and this is a silly example, but for whatever reason that a session of doing 1 kilometer reps at a particular intensity is useful for your 800-meter performance, and you start with the idea that you're going to do 4 of them as your training, and the person consistently is able to complete it at the prescribed level, obviously you've got a decision to make, because once it gets to the point where they're doing it without even breaking their sweat, that's not a challenging task anymore. And the concept that I have come to is this idea that unless you continually apply that stressor, you get a decay in their performance. And it's a very, a good colleague, a good, friend and colleague of ours that we have spoken about this, and he used an exceptionally good analogy, I thought, is, Avish Sharma, who's been on our podcast before, but he spoke about this idea very much in the sense of what happens with inflation. And the fact that if you, for instance, are earning the same amount of money, but everything becomes more expensive, in relative terms, you are going backwards. And when he said that, I started to think really strongly about what happens in these complex systems when you apply stress, and what happens when you remove stress, and what is the natural direction of travel of these systems.
Do you think it's better to describe it as applying stress or progressing stress? Because the thing that I'm getting from this is applying the repeated stimulus, you're starting to see a decay, not necessarily.
I think that's even better what you're saying. I think that's even better terminology of thinking of, it should always have this idea of progressive stress. Now, that's not to say that progression is linear.
No.
Particularly whether that's in a time scale or in a performance scale. It's not to say that you just add ad nauseum and expect the person to survive. You need to still have these concepts that you apply, as you said, that progressive stressor, and the system will need a period of time of adaptation and consolidation before it moves to a higher state of capability.
But the big thing, though, too, that I'm taking from this is, because, again, this is like something
This
might be
Unformed,
well, this is like, well, this might be obvious. Of course, you want to progress stress. But it's more about pushing a boundary that changes someone's perceptions, is what I'm gathering from this. I mean, yes, you would expect to see changes in their physical performance.
I think it's both. I think it's both what they believe they're capable of, but also changing what they are capable of. And those
Yeah.
things work hand in hand.
And that's probably also reflective then too of what magnitude of a jump are you making? Because it makes sense to make progressions to the physical stress to create improved performance. But do you actually need to make a certain jump that creates a certain psychological stress that then provides the seed to change someone's perceptions? Because I remember you started this conversation with thinking about goals and goal setting. And the thing I think of straight away as you talk about this is, does someone need to set a higher goal and then work to that by pushing themselves? Or is it actually the other way around? Do you actually need to provide a stimulus that challenges someone's perceptions of what they think is possible? And with that change, you actually see, you know what, actually, we talked about this PB. I actually think I can make this PB. Like, is it actually more of a secondary thing? And I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, it's a good question. I would need to think about that more. I on the surface, the first thing that comes to mind is that it would probably vary from person to person.
Yeah, that's sure.
Some people genuinely want evidence to see progress, and that's very much in the light of, motivational theories, and a really key one that tends to get used quite a bit in sport is something like self-determination theory. And one of the key components of self-determination theory is competence.
Yes.
And that by achieving a higher level of competence, it actually increases our motivational drive towards what we're doing. So for some people, that may be the highest driver. The other parts that people tend to have of that, in that one theory, it's not the only theory, obviously, of motivation, but in that one theory is autonomy, their ability to make their own decisions or be part of making the decisions around what that is. And that might be something as simple as being the one who sets that goal versus friend, parent, partner, coach, teammate, whatever it is. Like, this is the goal. This is what we're trying to do. And they're like, oh, I'm not that interested in that. So that, I think, is part of it. And then obviously the third one is, like, to do with relational factors and what that means in the context of, your interactions in your environment. And, people will often do things to improve that. In a lot of times in the idea of even reciprocity and how that influences it. But it's a very good question, because I think, and the only thing I can think of off the top of my head is that it's probably variable from person to person.
No, and look, I think as we start to try and unravel this or discuss it, it perhaps starts to make, well, at least partially explain the variation that you see in results and performance within your group, because it always seems that there's some people who are doing well, some people who are sort of average, and then some people who are not performing. And perhaps one of these elements, when we think about, do we need to apply certain physical challenges to challenge someone's perception, and therefore that changes their perception of themselves and what they can perform, versus a person who actually can challenge themselves already. They actually may not even need you to set the physical parameters, because they provide enough stress to themselves in a positive way to push themselves each time that they go into a session, because they've already set the goal and the standard really high.
Sorry, I'm thinking.
Yeah. Well, look, and this is obviously from me looking the outside in. So,
yeah, as I said, I think the only way to tackle that is really to try and understand that individual.
Well, and I think also too, going back to like what we want to try and explore here is understanding how complex systems respond to these different types of stresses.
Well, I think, like, I want to go back quickly, and I want to define this idea, because one of the thoughts that I kept having, and this is why I'm so frustrated even with myself, is if you are not providing something that the body, or even, as you said, psychologically or emotionally perceives as progression, the natural order of biological systems is one in which they will descend back towards a chaotic state. And where this comes from, for those people who are probably listening to this and thinking, what the hell I'm talking about, it very much comes from understanding of the concept of entropy, which is thermodynamics, physics thermodynamics concept around the idea that a contained system will actually descend into chaos unless energy is put into that system. And over time, if the amount of energy doesn't increase, that system will then decay slowly back towards that chaotic state.
Mm.
And we actually see this across lots of different concepts. In pretty much all complex systems, this is what happens. And this is the reason that, for instance, if you don't give rules to social structures, whether they be laws in a society or, I don't have children, but to your children, it descends into chaos. You need to create boundaries for people. Otherwise, the behavior becomes chaotic. And when you say chaotic, it's the strictest definition for that is a system which does not have defined boundary conditions. It's not a undefinable entity. It's that there are no boundary conditions. So almost any behavioral outcome is potentially possible there, right? Now, it's not saying that it reaches chaos, but it descends in that general direction. And that's, I think, what I've noticed is that they descend away from better, more coordinated and progressively improved performance. So I'm using this term and I'm probably stealing it from somewhere that is wrong, and I probably look like a dick if someone actually who understands this much better than I, but I've been using this concept of there's an entropic decay. It descends, and I say decay because I feel like it happens very gradually. It slides its way back because it's not that what you're providing is vastly non-progressive. It's only just under what they potentially need to keep getting better, but that is insufficient for improvement of that system. And that makes me think that if you do it over time, you will not necessarily make improvements. And a really, really...
Well, actually, the thing I think of straight away with this is aging.
Yes.
Because
this is go for this, because this is actually, I thought about this after we spoke about this, that is aging actually
this very phenomenon?
Yes, is aging, we almost think about it as disease state when you think of people like, is it Lynch or Sinclair? What's his
David Sinclair.
Yeah. He talks about it as, almost aging in this concept. But is it actually that we have built up capacity for certain stresses, but we don't progress them, so we end up decaying over time? And the way to get around that is that you need to consistently be pushing those boundaries. It's a very multifaceted environment, all the systems that we have capabilities in, but is it that we actually just aren't pushing those, and therefore the reason that we decay into senescence, and senility and all of those things is we actually are not pushing those envelopes.
Yeah, well, look, I think it's a good analogy to use just so people can understand where we're coming from, because I think otherwise we talk about these terms conceptually and people are thinking, what are you talking about? And this is, again, reflective of my limited knowledge of aging, but aging, it seems that a lot of researchers like David Sinclair now look at it as a disease state. And you're seeing certain people like Peter Diamandis, who has a longevity company in the States, looking at things that we can do to improve aging, because fundamentally some of David Sinclair's work has demonstrated that aging is simply a reflection of a cell's inability to adapt and provide the epigenetic signal to create changes in the environment.
But the question is that because that has lost that capability, or is it because we're not providing the stimulus that, as you said, is progressive?
Well, and this is where it's important to understand that there are lots of lifestyle factors that influence the aging process, and these are all the basic things that everyone talks about: sleep, diet, intermittent fasting, exercise, and so on. And I know, have you ever seen that entrepreneur Brian Johnson?
In passing, I actually haven't gone down that path. Have you looked at it?
Similar to, I've only really touched the surface, but
the guy looks like an alien.
He does look quite strange. He has something like
100
100 different capsules of supplements per day. But he currently holds the record, and I don't know how to measure this, of slowing down his relative aging. But is it reflective of that we are not applying enough stresses or progressive stresses that provide the right signals to a cell to maintain its function? And over time, it's, as you described me, it goes into this chaotic state where it loses its ability to function, and then that results in the aging process. And this is how I sort of see it similar, where we're kind of trying to go to the next stage, because from a performance standpoint, you're not thinking about trying to maintain performance.
No, you're always looking for progression of performance.
Correct. And that in a very similar fashion, it's not that they're going into some type of pathological state, but they are going into some disorganized state.
Yes, and that organization is a reflection of entropic behavior. Like the more energy you put in, and like when you talk about, when I say this, I say, for instance, like if it's a gas within, a glass bottle, the ordering and behavior of the molecules becomes more ordered by heating that. As you take or remove the heat, what ends up happening is they descend into less ordered behavior. So it becomes more chaotic in nature. That's what I'm talking about. And the same thing happens, as you said, in terms of performance. If you put more energy into that system, right, it remains ordered and it behaves in the way in which you have structured it to behave. But if you don't keep putting more energy into that system, it will slowly decay back to that level of disorganization, as you mentioned.
Yeah, and actually it's even like the most basic physiological level, because even from a performance standpoint, at a cellular level, you're not just trying to get the cell to maintain its function. You're really trying to go, no, I actually want you to push the boundaries to, and you can even think of it like to increase your 2x fiber type or increase the density of collagen, and this obviously then relates to the psychological profile, because there's obviously a very strong interaction between our physical capacities and our mental state. It's not about trying to maintain. It's about actually pushing beyond what you think is capable of, and as a result, what your physical body is capable of doing and performing. And so, when you think about from a performance perspective, even if on the surface it looks like, well, I'm applying a really strong physical stresses here, there's a lot of mechanical forces going in, shouldn't this create the physiological changes that you're looking for? It's like, well, have you actually capped that, in the sense of you have reached this point, but now you're only at this point? And it comes back to the conversations we've had about, the ceiling and the floor, is, can we actually adjust someone's ceiling?
Well, this was the question that as I said, I posed to Tim, and I don't think he really answered it. And I asked it obviously to a few other people as well, but is there a known ceiling in any entity? Or do we run out of time, and when I say time, I mean like almost like physical time in the day, or do we run out of the ability to recover? And is that individual? Because the interplay with all of this is, you can obviously keep adding more and more progressive stress stimulus and magnitude of stress, whether that be, as I said, density, volume, intensity, or a combination of all of those. But you need to be able to recover from that. So if you just keep adding, it's probably going to end up depleting these functions, and then you break down that system. But is it that there actually is a limit, or that we don't even search for it? And we actually don't know that and like the example I give, because I think all biological systems are very similar, yet we have self-defined limits, I believe, in, say, physical training, of like, you can't train more than 6 hours a day or something like that, right? But it's like, is that actually a limit, or is it just like it's impractical to do so? Or is it there's a limit because you can't recover enough from that? And has anyone actually tried on a very systematic level to do that? The thing that I think of with all biological systems that is clear is they all have almost unlimited capacity. And an example I would give is like, do we lose with our brain, right? We don't have a limit to how much knowledge we can gain. It's just that we lose motivation for learning new things. Some people learn quicker than others. Some people will require a lot more input to get the same learning or, capability. But actually, is it capped? Is there a point where, you get to a certain amount of knowledge and you get a message from your brain saying, sorry, the memory's full. You're like, you can't remember anything.
Please insert larger hard drive.
Yeah, like, please delete files to continue. I don't think that's a thing. So if that's a thing at our neurological level, which I think is probably the most complex biological structure that functions in the human body. If there's other ones, please someone educate me, but I think it's the brain. If that has that capability, why would more simplistic structures, and I say that in a very loose way because they are still very impressive in terms of, why would they lose capability before something like the brain that has much more to do and is much more important for our survival, and yet that still maintains the ability to have almost endless plasticity? Why would we lose that in, say, our muscle tissue or our tendon function or whatever it is from a performance perspective, or our, cardiovascular function? Like, I understand there are things like physical limits. So say for cardiovascular, like the actual size of your chest and thorax and lung structure and all those kind of things. But like, do you end up losing, for instance, the ability for oxygen exchange? Can that always be more efficient? Those kind of things. It's like, do we reach limits, or do most people get to a point where they're happy enough with the performance they get so they don't keep searching for more?
I'm actually trying to think of examples of this, and this is an interesting example. But I remember, for those of you who don't know, I did a 3-year yoga apprenticeship.
Well, I think this is I know where you're probably going with this, but like the limit does not exist almost.
Well, and I think it's also to understanding that we do create limitations with how we perceive the world and reality. I mean, this is just getting very philosophical here. But
tell this story.
Yeah. Well, so my yoga teacher, Duncan, he's a very intelligent, pretty out there guy, but he used to tell me stories of things like, well, a lot of the yogis, when they get to a certain level, like they can do things like stop their heartbeat. And I go,
what?
Bullshit. He's like, no, like they can. And like you'd read some of the text and they'd talk about it. And then actually at one point I was doing a review of yoga literature and I came across some research that these French scientists did back in like the 70s because they'd heard about some of these techniques. And they went to India and they met some of these, yogis who were pretty skeptical to do this stuff, but they're like, can you actually do this? And they go, well, yes, it can be done, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, well, can you prove it? And so they actually connected up ECGs so they can let's actually quantify this. The yogi would sit down, they get into a certain breathing state, and then all of a sudden they'd stop breathing, and then literally the ECG would just flatline. And sometimes it would flatline for periods that don't make sense because you would think that you would be causing brain damage because of a lack of blood flow, obviously, and therefore oxygen to the brain. And then, needless to say, ECG would come back alive, and then they'd come out of this certain state and take off the ECGs and go, all right, I've proven it to you now. And the only reason why I use it as an example is I think we need to stop and think about what is capable of humans.
Well, that's the biggest thing that looking at some of these programs told me. It wasn't to copy what they do.
No.
It was the principle that should be applied is don't limit what someone's capable of and be aggressive in the idea that you need to keep applying further stress in order for that system to grow. And when it's like the first time, I think you mentioned this in one of the podcasts, but the first time that you start going to the gym and, you think you're strong because you squat 50 kilos or your body weight or whatever. And then you see someone squat 200 kilos and you go, oh, okay, I'm not strong. And straight away you start changing your perception of what you are capable of.
Yes.
And it all of a sudden opens up a whole world. And then, you learn more and you're like, oh, this power lifter squatted 300 kilos or 400 kilos. And you're like, what is going on here? But it removes those shackles, as you said. And it's like straight away, as soon as you realize that, as you mentioned, someone can potentially stop their own heart from beating, which sounds completely nonsensical, right? you think, okay, maybe I do have more ability to influence this than what I initially thought.
Yeah, and I mean, going back to thinking about how this applies, with your coaching, clearly a lot of your athletes have talent.
Yeah.
That's not an issue. I mean, there's obviously variations of talent, but then part of that is also then about reaching what that individual is capable of. So, and this is actually a good discussion to have. Like, what is it that requires them to reach that potential? Let alone then thinking about, can you change that potential itself anyway? And are there certain psychological traits that are required, or maybe even better, that can be developed that allow that to be realized?
So I've been thinking about this a lot, like a lot. And the thought that I keep coming back to, and I'm not going to lie, I'm lazy. I look for the most efficient way to do it because I want a result yesterday.
Mm.
So I think about this and I'm like, what's the simplest way for me to know that they're having this stress applied? What's an easy way for me to measure whether they need, to recover? What are easy ways for me to make sure that they understand what this concept is? And from that initial part, the thing that you mentioned, which was the psychological setup of it, I think the mindset you have to have, and many people would be very aware of, the growth mindset discussions. People like Carol Dweck developed a lot of understanding of this. But just having this idea that every time you step into your performance environment that you're trying to get better, I think straight away changes how you view what you're doing. And you see things as being much more about upside risk versus downside risk. And I think it's something that perceptually changes quite a bit the moment you identify with one side versus the other.
Mm.
Like it's always really interesting where we're coming up to, the championship period. And the athletes that have the willingness to continue to want to get better all the way up to the championships versus the ones who are trying to save themselves to get there, and feel as though they've protected themselves is an interesting dynamic.
Or the other one I think of is the ones that are just wanting to get it over and done with because they've already mentally checked out.
Yeah, and I think that these are things that if you set that up, and we spoke with Susanna Russell.
Correct. Yeah.
About the idea of like, if you give someone the instruction that this is going to be a challenging period of training or competition, how much does that change the way that they perceive that challenge? And from what she said, and obviously she mentioned it was anecdotal, but I think it very highly affects, in a positive way, their perception. They see it as, I'm getting better from this because I'm challenging myself versus I have to survive this because my coach has prescribed this ridiculously hard period of training or competition.
And you actually mentioned this briefly during that talk of, there are clearly different athletes who perceive that challenge in different ways, like the survival versus opportunity.
Yes. And I think that is a really, really key factor from the psychological and emotional mindset that's needed in order for this to be successful.
And that seems to be something that, for as long as I've known you, you've thought about a lot of, do you need to respect how someone feels and adjust, say, their training methodology around that? Or, and I know you've mentioned this before when you look at previous generations of athletes who would be like competing every weekend, and they would see that every time that they compete is an opportunity, even though obviously competing so regularly wouldn't be
not necessarily
ideal for your performance.
Well, it might be, but you're not necessarily going to run, say, personal best every time you do it.
Sure.
But they didn't perceive that as being damaging. And I think that's just a completely different mindset to what, say, athletes now have of like, I need to recover all the time. It's what we spoke about with Susanna. Like, sometimes I think the mentality that people have is they're recovering from nothing.
Yeah, Greg Heff, I remember, used to talk about that all the time as well.
Yeah, it's true. It's like, if you're going to recover, you better have trained sufficiently to warrant such recovery. And so practically, I've been thinking a lot about, well, how do you even set this up? How do you measure those things? And I think it requires a nuance. It requires being open to the dynamic nature of a training environment and not being too prescriptive in what you're doing. So even though you might have, this is the session that we had planned, you need to be willing to adapt on the fly. And the big thing that I've been doing is just measuring, say, the performance, whether, simple things like just timing with a stopwatch. And looking at in both as an opportunity or the risk side of things and being able to identify, okay, like we said that we were going to do 6 of these repetitions, whatever they are. If they get to 4 of them and the performance is declining significantly, and there might be 10%, 15%, whatever it is, and you can see that the performance is not matching what you believed to be appropriately possible, then potentially on that day, you've actually created enough stress and you need to alter how much you're going to prescribe. And alternatively, in order for searching for that progressive challenge and that progressive application of stress, using the information you're getting back to make sure that you are creating some level of resistance against what you've applied. And what I mean by that is, if you say you're going to do, and I use the example right at the start of 4 by 1K reps. If you do 4 and they all get faster, is that challenging the athlete? Because they're probably not even fatiguing at all. So unless you're looking for the psychological benefit of them walking away saying, oh, I'm King Kong, I just smashed that session. If you're looking for the physiological adaptation, it doesn't seem like that stressed them particularly. And so you might do at the 5th rep, and they get faster, and then the 6th rep, and they get faster. At that point, if you don't think that they're actually being challenged, even though it's more than what they've done, should you stop? And I don't have the answer to that. My thought has been very much that you should seek a level of acute failure akin to what we've spoken about before with safe to fail experiments. You look for the point at which the challenge actually is challenging them. And until you reach that, you're probably not done. And that doesn't matter if on one day it's 4 repetitions, on one day it's 12. On that day, it created the stress that you wanted. And then you've got to be willing to continuously measure after that what the response is. And there's lots of obviously different ways people can give you an understanding of if they're fatigued, things around sleep measures, their, perception of how tired they are, the performances in consequent sessions. They often will talk about things like changes in tissue tone, soreness, tightness. And if you are measuring things, whether it's things like heart rate variability or measures relating to central nervous system function or performance measures, people use things like jump readiness and all of those kind of things. And some of those, how much they transfer, is difficult to know. But if someone says to you, I'm actually perceiving I'm really tired following that session, that's probably an indication that that was a sufficient stressor and you may need to give them more time to be prepared.
Yeah, and the thing that stands out to me with this is understanding and appreciating the limitations of programming. And it actually ties in well with the psychological attributes you're trying to develop, because you can only take advantage of these opportunities when they present themselves, because there is no programming of, oh, you're actually doing well today, let's do 2 more reps. You have to be opportunistic in that situation, which in itself actually requires a certain psychological trait from the athlete and the coach too, but the athlete of going, oh, right, I hadn't prepared for this. I had my program beforehand.
Yeah, and I saw that I was doing 4. Why am I now doing 7?
Yes, yeah.
And that, for a lot of athletes, is very challenging because a lot of them are actually, as I said, their motivation. It's actually, you made me think of something really good, which is that the ones who seem to struggle with this are the ones that are highly motivated by their own competence. So for those ones, it's really difficult because if you always move the goalposts on them, they can't deal with it very well because they haven't had that dopamine hit of satisfaction that makes them think that they tick that box, they achieve that task.
Yep.
If you ask them, and I guess this is how you have to redefine it for them, of like, until you seek acute failure, you have not actually completed the task. And I don't say like, ultimate failure. I just say acute failure in the sense of, as I said, even if it's a small diminishment of like, what you're seeking out here is the moment in which your body says, okay, I'm actually starting to feel this. And that might be, some of it might be perceptive, some of it might be, physiological, peripheral, central, doesn't really matter. But it's like, you're reaching that point of like, ooh, okay, this is actually hard now.
Yeah. And look, I can't remember where I've heard this, but the analogy of like you have two circles, and you have the circle of comfort and then the circle of discomfort. And the only other magic that happens in your life, whether it's related to physical development, psychological development, emotional, is outside of that circle of comfort. And so, I think this is such a basic, but actually such a vital principle to stand by of seeking opportunities to go outside of that point of discomfort.
And I don't think the thing that I had a discussion, and obviously he's been on the podcast before with Tom Templeton, who works with us, and he's, and it's a very valid point. He said, but then are you setting someone up to dig a really deep hole of fatigue? And I think it's valid. Like, I don't know the answer. I think it's a really important thing. If you're always seeking discomfort and challenges and progress, is there a point where you've dug so deep that you aren't getting out of that hole?
In short, yes. And this is where I think it's important to don't throw the baby out with the bathwater of using certain parameters that you mentioned before to actually monitor the current state of an individual. But you kind of need to flirt with this risk.
And this is this idea that it's the same as this conversation, right? We don't know where it's going. And I've heard this term used recently in a podcast that I really liked, was, the idea of the golden path, which is, the path by which you are in part challenging yourself and you don't know necessarily the answer, but you're looking to tread lightly and carefully so that you maintain a level of attention to getting towards your destination. Now, that definition is my definition, and it can be vary, I guess. But it's this idea that you're treading this path that you've got to be really, really aware and perceptive to what is going on. Otherwise, you do risk descending into either direction, which is complete and utter risk-taking, and you're not paying attention and you're just piling on more and more training, which is, negligent in itself. But then there's the other side of it, which may be where you stick only with your prescription, and that is leaving a lot of opportunities on the table. And speaking with Avish, it was really good to get his perspective on this, because he gets the opportunity to work with a lot of Australia's best track coaches and field coaches in his role at the VIS. And he was saying some of the more successful ones are actually the ones whose mentality is that they're much happier to fly close to the sun, right? And he said, you would think that they would have more issues, but he goes, they have, a lot of them have adapted to know what the signals are to modify.
Yes.
But they're willing to keep pushing as long as those markers are not coming up. And to me, that was a really, I'm not going to lie, it was, for me, it was confirmational bias to be like, yes, okay, like maybe this makes sense. And I need to be careful with that and question myself. But it highlights very, very strongly that you're better off erring, particularly in performance, on the side of looking for opportunities than protecting what you already have. And I think that seems to be a really big factor across all aspects of these biological systems. Because as you said, the moment that you are in a state of comfort, you are protecting what you already have. And that can be really dangerous because you do not get challenge or growth. And I think you have to also move forward in your actions for this in a way in which you accept the level of risk that comes with extending, not only yourself, but the individuals you're dealing with. And I think this is both in a psychological realm, in an emotional realm, in a, physical realm, because I have lots of conversations, even with my athletes, of how difficult some of the tasks that they would like to be able to achieve are.
Mhm.
Even if you put it into the context of basic statistics, for instance, and this is part of it, if you look at the qualification standards now for, say, the 100 and 200 meters, they're exceptionally difficult. And I'll speak in reference, or say if I speak in reference to the men's 100 meter adults. The current qualification stand for outright qualification, now there is obviously a way of qualifying through world ranking, but through direct qualification is to run 10.00. In Australian history, there is one man that has ever done that, right? So to think, and if we just put that in the context of the last 100 years, the modern Olympics since 1896, there's been one Australian person that has been able to do that. So for you as an individual who's aspiring to do that, even on a really basic statistical level, it is so improbable that you will be that person. Now, it's not to say that you can't, because the probability is not zero, but it is improbable. And if it is improbable, it suggests that what the task you're taking on is extremely difficult to achieve. If that is the case, it's probably likely that you will need to undertake a lot of discomfort and difficulty in order to get to that level of performance. And I've said this to some of my athletes, and some of them, they're super intelligent, they get it straight away and they go, yeah, this shouldn't be easy. Just because I've trained hard or I've been consistent and I've been training hard consistently, that's not enough to just say that it will happen. And then there are others who don't get that. They think that because they've put in those factors, that it should be probable for them to reach a level of improbable capability. And I think it's really important that me as a coach and these athletes as individuals need to reflect on the fact that you have taken on a very difficult task. And in order to do that, we all need to be extending ourselves at every opportunity and be willing to openly tread that path of knowing that we may step over, but be willing to explore it in a way in which we are monitoring what we are doing and seeking a level of feedback that will mean that we don't get too far away from that. And yeah, I don't know if any of that made sense or it just sounds like absolute gobbledygook, but I'm trying really hard to understand how you can consistently and create principles that will lead to performance over time. And I can't seem to see a way that it's possible without this idea of progressive stress application and a mindset in which people see that as their way forward.
And look, that's what I was going to emphasize. And it's obviously not to dismiss that you have to have a certain talent and skill level to begin with. But if you as an individual see it as improbable, the likelihood of achieving that is going to be lower. And it's actually something I think of straight away of, and I'd be interested to maybe talk to some psychological researcher to ask about this. Is if you had an Australian athlete who is, let's say, a very good athlete, they run 10:10, and you got them to live in Jamaica for 2 years, where they are
there's consistently running 9:9.
Does that change their ability to improve their performance? Because does that actually change your perception when you actually physically see it?
And you feel it, like if you're running next to someone who runs those times, does it change what you think is possible?
Completely. And it's just, I don't have an answer to that. It's a question I thought of straight away. But
I think it's probably the case.
I think so. It's like you said before about squatting, and you're squatting 50 kilos,
And then
thinking
you
you're
see
all
someone
great,
doing
and
200.
You see someone doing 200, you go, oh, that's what's possible.
Oh,
And it does start to change your perception.
enormously.
Like I used to always think that with yoga, where I'm certainly not the most flexible person. You would see these people.
You're a lot more flexible than me, mate.
I don't know. You've got some. I reckon you might be a bit of a dark horse, John.
You see my hunchback. I'm Quasimodo.
But yeah, no, it's a reality when you start to think of what do you actually believe is capable. And again, there's obviously certain limitations. I'm not thinking for myself personally I'm going to be running sub 10 seconds, but
no, it's more about understanding.
It's about that bandwidth, actually, in a way of thinking of it too.
That,
yeah, it's where do you see your potential capacity?
And I think, like, to highlight for people another example of this, especially of people who are involved, say, in track and field, they would be very aware of this. Is one of the big problems we see quite dramatically is that people get to world junior level, which is under 20 championships internationally, and then they don't progress. And the things that happen, one is they get injuries, but the other thing that happens is their performance actually, for some people, just declines. And the thought that I've had from this is that it may be that the non-application of greater progressive stress to that individual means that they don't continue to get better. And there's a whole other part of this, which is that it potentially comes down to, what exposure you've had before. And has that exposure happened in a progressive fashion so that you are set up to accept further application of progressive stress? And the example would be is taking too big a jump or not creating some of the foundational properties that we've spoken about in order for you to be able to do those things.
Of course.
Yeah. Is there any more that you think we can unpack there? I'm not sure that I have much more to add, and I'm not sure that I made any sense. But for those people who did listen to this podcast, honestly, I do appreciate, one, you getting this far, and two, indulging Jack and I for exploring an idea that we're unformed at this stage.
No, well, I think we leave it at that. I think perhaps in future, as our own understanding or ideas develop or evolve, we
might come back to it.
Yeah. But I think we leave it there for today.
Thank you very much for joining us, as always.